13 nights. That's how long American bombs fell on Iran without stopping. Then, on a Friday, they just stopped. No press conference, no victory speech, no explanation. Just silence. And that silence should scare you more than the bombing ever did. For 13 straight nights, American warplanes and missiles hit targets across Iran. Night after night, without pause, without rest. This wasn't a single strike or a warning shot. This was one of the most sustained military campaigns the world has seen in years, with reports pointing to more than 300 targets hit across the country. That kind of pace, night after night for nearly 2 weeks straight, is something most modern wars never even attempt, let alone sustain. Then, on a Friday night, it simply ended. Not with a bang, but with nothing at all. No announcement from the White House, no press conference, no president stepping in front of a camera to explain what had just happened or why. One moment the sky over Iran was lit up with explosions, and the next moment there was nothing, just quiet. A source close to the Defense Department told reporters that operations were, in their own words, on hold. Not ended, not finished, not canceled. On hold. Sit with that phrase for a second because it's carrying more weight than it looks like at first glance. A hold is not peace. A hold is a pause with an invisible clock attached to it, and right now, almost nobody outside a small circle of officials knows exactly how much time is left on that clock. Here's the real question that almost nobody is asking clearly enough. Why would the most powerful military on the planet suddenly go quiet at the exact moment it looked like it was building towards something even bigger? Because that's exactly what was happening. This wasn't a war that was slowing down on its own. It was a war that was about to grow into something much larger, and then, without warning, it didn't. To understand why that pause matters so much, you need to understand how this conflict actually reached this point. Because none of this happened by accident, and none of it happened overnight. Go back to last summer. Israel and Iran fought a brutal 12-day war that pulled outside powers into the region almost immediately. That war ended with something the world had never actually seen before. The United States directly struck Iran's nuclear facilities, hitting the enrichment sites that Iran had spent decades building and protecting. For the first time in history, an American president ordered a direct military strike on another country's nuclear weapons program. Military planners and diplomats had talked about that exact moment for years as a line that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. That window didn't hold. Talks that were supposed to start in a quiet location meant for technical negotiations were called off before they even began. Trust between the two countries, already thin after decades of hostility, kept breaking down week after week. By spring, strikes on Iran's nuclear sites had already started again. As the months passed, tensions kept climbing, with each side testing how far it could push without triggering the exact kind of full-scale war that neither side was publicly willing to admit they wanted. By the middle of this July, all of that slow buildup turned into something that looked very much like open war again. The United States was striking Iran almost every single night. Iran and the groups allied with it were hitting back across the wider region, from military bases to shipping lanes to nearby countries caught in the middle. That was the world just 10 days ago, a campaign that had grown so large and so relentless that it had stopped looking like a limited strike and started looking like a full-scale air war. And it's exactly that scale, exactly that pace that couldn't be sustained forever that led to the decision that changed everything this past weekend. Because behind closed doors, something was being discussed that went far beyond anything that had already happened. And that's where the real story actually begins. Picture this. Not a battlefield, not a runway full of jets warming up. A quiet room inside the White House, no cameras, no reporters, just a handful of the most powerful people in the country sitting around a table, deciding whether to make this war 100 times bigger than it already was. That room is where the real story of this pause actually begins. Not on the ground in Iran, but in a conversation almost nobody was allowed to hear. Here's what reportedly happened inside that meeting. Based on accounts multiple officials have since given to journalists. The president sat down with his most senior political and military advisors to weigh something enormous. Not another night of the strikes that had already been happening for nearly 2 weeks. Something far bigger. Multiple sources have described it plainly as consideration of a massive escalation, a dramatically larger attack than anything the campaign had tried so far. According to that reporting, the plan being discussed included widening strikes to hit energy infrastructure directly, targeting coastal radar systems and air defenses, and even talking about a possible move of troops near one of Iran's most important oil export points on the coast. Stop and actually picture what that would have meant. Not a strike on a hidden nuclear facility. Not a strike on a military command center. An attack aimed straight at the economic lifeline of an entire country, and quite possibly troops physically present on Iranian soil for the first time in this entire conflict. That's not a bigger version of what was already happening. That's a completely different war, with a completely different set of risks, a completely different set of consequences, and no clear idea of how it would end. And in that exact room, at that exact moment, two of the most powerful men in the American national security system pushed back against it. The vice president raised concerns about pushing the conflict any further, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the single highest-ranking military officer in the entire country, raised a warning that almost never gets said out loud in front of a sitting president and almost never leaks to the public this fast. According to the sources who described that meeting, the chairman told the room plainly that the bigger operation could be done and that it would likely succeed. He didn't say it was impossible. He said the opposite. It could work. But then he laid out exactly what it would cost the country to actually pull it off. That cost wasn't only about money, though the money alone is enormous. It was about supply, about the missiles and defensive systems that exist specifically to protect American troops, allied countries, and global shipping from retaliation. He specifically raised deep concern about how many defensive interceptor missiles the country had left, the very system that had been protecting bases, cities, and ships throughout this entire war. Think about what that actually means. The most senior military officer in the country stood in front of the president and said, in plain terms, we can win this specific fight, but we might not have enough left afterward to properly protect ourselves. That is not hesitation. That is not weakness. That's simple math delivered as a direct warning by someone whose entire job is to know exactly how much the country has left in reserve. That single warning is why the bombing stopped, not because the mission couldn't be completed, not because anyone lost the will to fight, but because carrying it out could have left the country dangerously exposed the moment it was finished, with no cushion left if anyone decided to strike back. The plan wasn't canceled. Based on everything reported so far, it was only set aside. And that difference matters more than almost anything else in this entire story, because setting a plan aside is not the same thing as walking away from it for good. It's still sitting there, waiting for the right moment to come back onto the table. And what could bring it back is something even more uncomfortable than the meeting itself. A number. A very specific number that almost nobody outside a small circle of officials wanted to say out loud. Here's a number that should stop you for a second. 1,200. That's how many Patriot interceptor missiles the United States had already fired in this conflict, by this spring alone, before the most intense stretch of nightly strikes had even started. Each one of those missiles costs more than $4 million. Do that math for a moment. That's not a small line item buried somewhere in a defense budget. That's a bleed. A steady, expensive drain on one of the most important defensive systems the country owns, and it happened before things had even reached their peak. This is the part of the story almost nobody talks about when they cover this war, and it might be the most important part of all. Wars are not only won through courage or political will or public support, they are limited, quietly and without mercy, by supply. You cannot fire a weapon you do not have. You cannot stop an incoming missile with an interceptor that's still sitting in a factory somewhere, months away from being finished. And when the single highest-ranking military officer in the country stands in front of the sitting president and says plainly, we can win this fight, but we may not have enough interceptors left to properly defend ourselves afterward, that's not fear talking. That's arithmetic, delivered in a military uniform as a direct warning. And the problem didn't start with this war. Add in years of supporting Ukraine's fight against Russia, plus the ongoing conflict against Houthi forces in Yemen, and a much bigger picture starts to come into focus. America's supply of some of its most critical defensive weapons has been pulled from in multiple directions all at once, and Iran is only one front competing for exactly the same limited stockpile. The United States ambassador to the United Nations was sent out publicly the following weekend to explain all of this, and he did something fairly unusual for someone in that position. He didn't deny the stockpile problem. He admitted it directly on national television, saying plainly that a lot of stockpiles are depleted. He pointed to years of weapons sent to support Ukraine, and separately to the drain caused by the extended fight in Yemen. And then, in the very same breath, he insisted that the United States still has everything it needs to keep going in Iran if the president decides to. Notice the tension sitting inside that one statement. Stockpiles are depleted, and yet everything needed is still available. Both of those things are being said as true at the exact same time. And that contradiction, whether you call it careful wording or simple spin, is exactly the space this entire pause is currently living inside. So the strikes stopped. But in almost any war, stopping is rarely actually about stopping. It's almost always about buying time. And the real question becomes, time for what, exactly, and time for who? The official explanation coming out of Washington is that this pause exists to give diplomacy a real chance to work. A senior official told reporters that the president's stated preference has always been diplomacy first, but that he wanted Iran to see clearly what would happen if it refused to negotiate seriously. In other words, the pause is being presented, at least publicly, as a form of pressure. Stop the bombs for now, but keep the threat of even bigger bombs clearly visible on the table, and see if that pressure is enough to push Iran toward the negotiating table. There's only one real problem with that version of events. Iran isn't telling the same story at all. And what Iran said publicly this week, on camera, in front of its own people, tells you exactly how far apart these two sides actually are, and exactly why this pause might be far more fragile than anyone in Washington wants to admit. Iran's foreign ministry held a televised press conference this week, and the message coming out of it did not sound like a government quietly preparing to sit down at a negotiating table. The spokesperson stated plainly that there are no talks currently happening with the United States, not paused talks, not talks being prepared behind the scenes, no talks at all. He went further, saying Iran will never allow the United States to decide when this war ends and when peace begins. He placed the blame for the entire conflict directly on Washington, calling it aggression that Iran holds America fully responsible for. He even singled out European allies, accusing them of standing with the side he called the aggressor. This is not the language of a country quietly getting ready to compromise in private. This is the language of a government drawing hard lines in public for its own people to see, making it clear that whatever peace eventually comes has to look like something Iran can call a win at home, not something that looks like giving in. So here's the honest picture. Washington says this pause exists to give room for negotiation. Iran says there's no negotiation happening anywhere right now. Both of these statements can be technically true at the same time. And that gap, that quiet contradiction sitting underneath the surface, is exactly what makes this moment so unstable. A pause that both sides are reading in two completely different ways is not something you can build lasting peace on. It's a shared silence where both sides are quietly rearming, repositioning, and waiting to see who moves first. There is, however, one place where something that actually looks like real diplomacy is happening, and it tells you a lot about what this entire war is really about underneath all the noise. Officials from Iran have been meeting directly with a neighboring country, specifically to talk about safe shipping through a narrow strip of water that carries a massive share of the world's oil every single day. Iran has been careful to describe these talks as strictly separate from the wider war, just two neighboring countries working out safe passage through shared waters. Why does that matter so much? Because whenever tension rises in this region, the very first thing markets watch isn't troop movements or speeches, it's oil tankers and whether they're still moving safely through that narrow passage. And during this pause, the price of oil actually dropped instead of spiking, settling more than 6% lower. That's worth noticing because it tells you something important. Markets are not pricing in real, lasting peace here. They're pricing in a short breath, a small window of calm that traders expect could reverse at any moment without warning. Meanwhile, the wider war connected to all of this hasn't slowed down at all. Iran-backed forces in Yemen struck a fuel refinery, the first direct attack on that kind of energy target in 4 years. A missile defense system operated by an allied crew intercepted more attacks aimed at a major port that handles most of a neighboring country's oil exports. And in an unexpected twist, accusations have surfaced connecting a completely different war, the one in Eastern Europe, to this one, with claims of a strike thousands of miles away and satellite information allegedly being shared between countries on opposite sides of the globe. Two wars that most people think of as completely separate are now quietly bleeding into each other. And underneath everything sits the one question nobody can actually answer with confidence. Whether the strikes on Iran's nuclear program actually destroyed what they were meant to destroy, or only delayed it by a matter of months. Different officials give different answers, and you cannot verify something you cannot inspect on the ground, especially in the middle of an active war. A pause in bombing has never once in history meant the actual end of a war. What's happening right now isn't peace breaking out, it's a system holding its breath before whatever comes next. And both sides are quietly betting that the other one runs out of room first. The next time the sky over Iran goes silent again, that silence will finally answer whether this was the sound of a war actually ending or simply both sides quietly reloading.